sometimes we're able to release somebody on our own. Danny Fenster from Myanmar, we brought back on our own. Taylor Dudley, we brought back on our own from Russia. And those are typically made because of emotional attachments and emotional leverage. So we create enough of a relationship for the captors to say, yeah, no, we're going to do that for you. So it still is a sort of a transaction, but it is really the way I like to look at negotiations, which is our ability to influence somebody else's behavior.
Hi, everyone. I'm Dror Stein, subbing for beloved host Amitai. Welcome to the Z3 podcast by the Z3 Project. Today, we're delighted to speak with Mickey Bergman. Mickey is an incredible expert negotiator who is involved with a few of the most complex hostage release negotiations in the world. He is the Vice President and Executive Director of the Richardson Center for Global Engagement, has been nominated for the Nobel Peace Prize alongside with former Governor Bill Richardson, and has facilitated a few of the most complex prisoner and hostage release in the world as we know them today. Mickey is going to experience and share with us his story about growing up in Israel, a few of the values and the skill set that he has acquired throughout the years to bring him to this moment, and also share what is the emotional toll that he is experiencing doing this important and sacred work. We hope you enjoyed this conversation. Join us in our various platforms in YouTube, X, TikTok, and Facebook. Thanks for watching. I'm so humble and excited to have you here with us at the Z3 podcast with the Z3 Project. It's a true honor. I have many things to ask you, but before we really dive into your profession and what you do, I have to ask you something personal. First, I want to start with the beginning.
Yes.
You were born in 1976.
Yes. Of
all years. And as an Israeli, as a Jew, I mean, the first memory that I have, I wasn't born yet in 1976, but the first thought that I have is, oh my goodness, this is the same year of Operation Antibi,
Correct.
Operation Yonatan, and this man was born to help with negotiations of hostage release around the world. So take us back to the beginning. Where are you from?
I was born in Tel Aviv. Yes, 1976. I wasn't born and watched TV immediately to see the Entebbe rescue, but I grew up on the myth of that a lot. Born to an Israeli father and mother that immigrated to Israel from England. Mm-hmm. One brother, and grew up at some point when I was about 6. My father ran out of work in Israel, and he took us all to Nigeria, where he could find work. He worked for a construction company there, Solel Boneh. And so we spent 3 years in Nigeria as kids, which kind of gave me a little bit of a different angle on life. And then I came back and grew up in Ra'anana for the rest of the time.
So you were 9 when you returned?
Yes.
Excellent. Tell me a little bit about your military service. Fast forward a few years later. Yeah,
so it's funny because as a teenager, I was kind of shy and an introvert. And I never thought that I'm going to end up in the battlefield. There was a lot of fear involved in this, but once you hit 16, 17, there's something that happens in the dynamic in Israel. And it's suddenly like a competition of what's the best unit you can ever get to. And so I got into the tests for the pilot course. And I was very excited about that because I wanted to be a pilot, of course. Who doesn't? And about 2 months before the pilot course tests, like the physical tests, I broke my ankle.
Worst timing.
Except that it didn't stop me.
Really?
And I went for it, and I made it into the pilot course, which was great. I survived about 8 months until they booted me out. I did well on the flying, which was nice. But when I look back at it, I was 18. I was not mature enough. And that was really my problem, because at some point, 6 months into it or 4 months into it, you start commanding the next group in basic training. And these were my friends, same class in high school. They just started 6 months after me. I had a lot of trouble with that.
Did you?
Yeah. And so I think they kicked me for a good reason, kicked me out. But hey, 400 start, about 20 finish. So statistically, most of us get kicked out.
There you go.
And from there, I went to the artillery forces and became a forward coordinator for the artillery with special forces. So I was with a paratrooper unit, an elite paratrooper unit, and that's 6 years in South Lebanon.
Wow. So you're actually partners with paratroopers, right? It's
Yes.
a partnership between
so
two units.
the job is you actually go in with them in special operations, and you don't do anything. You're unless something happens. And when something bad happens, you're responsible for the rescue fire, both the coordinating the artillery and the Air Force rescue, and get yourself and your colleagues out. And we had quite a few of those. And it's interesting because in Israel, everything is so small that while I was in the Eastern Division in South Lebanon, I had 2 division commanders. One was Benny Gantz, who was the commander of the paratroopers division, and the other one was Yair Golan, who was the commander of the Eastern Division of the unit inside Lebanon. And so I had the ability to serve under both of them. Very different people.
Different from one another, or from what they are today? No,
very different people from each other. They're actually very similar today to how they were. I mean, there were kids there. It's funny because I thought about them as big commanders, but they were in their 30s at that time. I'm now 48. I'm like, I look back, but I see, because of my work and the nature of my work, I focus not on the substance, I focus on the personalities. And you can see certain attributes, and years later, as politicians, they're very much the same. The same as they used to be. They're very different from each other, but they're very much, there's a lot of similarities in how they used to be as commanders and how they are now as political leaders.
So you're pointing out something very important that I would want to go back to later in the conversation about your analysis of people that I know is very, very helpful in what you do today. That's very important. But take me back to Lebanon for a little bit. What time was that? What were the years? Just put us in history.
Yeah, so the year 1994 to 2000. So I was there in the last 6 years of the Israeli presence in South Lebanon. That was a time of transition in South Lebanon from being part of allies of the South Lebanese army, and the population in South Lebanon at that time, early on, since Israel took over the buffer zone, there was a period in which there was quiet and calm in the buffer zone in South Lebanon, because Israel invested in schools, in infrastructure, supported the South Lebanese army as an ally, and the rest of Lebanon was in a civil war. So everybody, all the residents in the south liked us. Then the war in the rest of Lebanon calmed down, and the fighting came down to the south. And at some point, if you're Lebanese, before that, your life is better than the rest of them, you're happy. But at that point, suddenly, everybody else's life is better than yours, so you won't change. And it's something that I realized when we served there, we met with a lot of we worked with the local community. We would meet, we'd had dinners in the local villages, and you started feeling the transition. And the transition was not because suddenly they hated us. It had nothing to do with hate. It manifested itself in hateful events, but it wasn't about hate. It was about the family. Can I remember one of the head of villages had one son that was with the South Lebanese army, our allies, and the other one was with Hezbollah. And they were not different between them. The only difference was they had different answer to the question, who is going to be in charge in a couple of years? And if the answer was the Israelis, you stay with the South Lebanese army. If the answer is Hezbollah, you need to prove your loyalty to Hezbollah. Again, not because you have any different feelings towards the Israeli soldiers, but because all you care about is your own family, their well-being, their opportunities, and their security. And that's something that stuck with me, because it showed me something about human beings inside conflict, and removes that air that we're so stuck with of hatred and anger. Hatred and anger exist, but it's not at the core of what we do. It's a symptom. I'm
wondering, you're taking me forward again.
Yeah, sorry.
I'm wondering, no, that's perfectly fine. That's beautiful. It's the nature of a conversation. There's a sentence you said, and I can't remember in which context.
Hopefully I'll remember. I mean,
it's a test. So if you don't remember, points are reduced.
The joke is I wrote this book a year ago. I don't remember what's in it. Yeah.
That's the thing about writing books, right? It takes a long time until it
It's a full year from the moment you submit it until.
And what a year it has been.
Yeah, that's exactly right. You know, there's a few little things that happen in that year.
Well, unfortunately for us, this is a topic that is extremely relevant.
Of course.
Right. I want to take you back to a sentence you once said, and that relates to what you said about your time in South Lebanon. You said that our enemies are not born evil, and that we're not pure. We're not born pure either.
Yeah.
Have you ever found yourself relating? Actually, let me rephrase the question. Is that on?
Yeah.
Okay, I'm taking you back to a sentence you once said about our enemies not born evil, and about us who are not born pure either. Mm-hmm. Is this something that you learned back in your military experience?
It is in a way, and I've learned it even more so since. But it was the first glimpse of it, I think, in the military when I was in South Lebanon, when I realized there was a moment when I was considering the questions that they're asking themselves for their security of who's going to be responsible after we leave. That I realized for a glimpse that you don't think about it when you're 18 or 19 or 20 and you're just there to fight because you're protecting the northern cities of Israel, is that for them we were occupiers. For them we were physically impacting their livelihood for our own interests. Now, everything that I say and everything that I do, it's not about justifying or not justifying, it's just understanding that. And that's where I get to this. And I start realizing, and I think that was the first seed for me. And then when I came to the United States, I actually had much more of a growth of that. That nobody actually wakes up in the morning and says, "I'm evil. Let's see what evil I can do." At least nobody that I met with, and I've met with people who are responsible for terrible things. Whether it's, from North Korea, from the military government in Myanmar, the Russians, Venezuelans, individually they're not evil people. There's circumstances that bring bad stuff out of them, and I'm not saying it in order to absolve them of the responsibilities. I'm just saying it in order to because I need to, in my nature of work, I need to cling to something, to find humanity somewhere, because that's where we connect and that's where we can get tangible things. So it sounds like tree hugging. It's not really. There's a difference between empathy and sympathy in all of this. And empathy is when you actually try to genuinely get into somebody else's shoes to understand how they see the world and how they see their own role in the world. Sympathy is when you start conflating your own interest with theirs. And in my kind of work, empathy is a must, it's a necessity. Otherwise we can't achieve anything. Sympathy is a trap. But here's the thing, Dror. People who are not used to exercising empathy, in order to criticize those who do, they conflate empathy and sympathy. So if I would say something like I just said now about understanding, a Lebanese kid who decides to side with Hezbollah, I would be labeled as a traitor. I'm not justifying the actions that person did as a Hezbollah warrior. But I have to understand why he did that and what motivates him, because that will allow me to figure out how we will respond to different things that we bring together and how we can actually, if there's something tangible that we can get together.
Wow. And how did you develop this skill? This sounds like the most important skill that you need.
The one thing I didn't do, I did not study psychology.
You did not study psychology?
I did not study psychology. I studied international relations. I learned it, I have two main influences. I have many influences, but two main influences on this part. 50% of it is Governor Bill Richardson, who I met and I worked for 17 years until he passed away in September of last year. And from him, I learned. For him, it wasn't an intellectual exercise. It was gut for him. It was an instinct. He had a gift in approaching people and trying to figure out. I was watching it and trying to intellectualize it, and he was enough with this riffraff kind of thing. It's people that have a gift, they think that everybody has it. So he had that. So I learned a lot of the little shticks and how he does things in negotiations and how he treats people even if he disagrees with them. And then the second half, I learned from my wife. And I'm not just saying it to buy some brownie points from her because
you're away from home right now. Maybe she's alone.
Exactly. I'm not doing it for that, but because And my wife actually suffers from depression. And she has been suffering from it, diagnosed at least for about 20 years now. And coping with this, and she's very open about it, and very honest about it. But coping with depression together forced me to learn something about emotional intelligence that I've never knew before. I actually didn't know this existed before.
Really?
Yeah. And she taught me a lot of that. When you deal with somebody with depression, you have to also come to terms with the fact that your brain can't exactly understand how their brain works and how they're thinking, but you still need to figure out how to support and do what they need without getting the insults from it. So, for example, when your partner, in this case my wife, she goes into a depressive mode, a depressive dip, and I ask her, do you want to talk about it? When she says no, you can't get insulted by it. It's not an assault to you. She's actually articulating genuinely what she needs. And then you're able to say, if you get offended, then you're digging in, you're spiraling, you can't really communicate, can't really help. But it's actually accepting the fact, that's what you need now. Do you want me to just sit next to you and be silent? Do you want me to be in the next room? Or do you want me out of the house? Without being offended by it. Yeah. Because it requires you to understand emotionally, even though you can't understand the brain, emotionally where she's at. And I had no choice but to cope with it. Because that happened when we were only 2 years into our marriage. We're now 22 years, so it's been successful. But 2 years into our marriage, trust me, at the beginning it was really tough. It's like, 2 years married to me and she's already depressed. Like, you take it personally, and you learn to cope with it over time. And I was in grad school at the time at Georgetown. And I just started taking those lessons and applying them in what I was doing in international relations. And it was working.
Tell us exactly how you did this. So I know that you speak a lot about emotional intelligence. Now I understand who are the tutors behind this, which you owe your profession to in many aspects.
Look, I was born and raised an Israeli man. Emotional intelligence is not necessarily the strongest side. It's not the trademark.
Yeah, I can see what you're saying. I can understand what you're saying. Tell us how the development of emotional intelligence for you served you over the years. It sounds like, when you're communicating with people holding other people hostage and with
hostages. The kidnappers?
The kidnappers. When you communicate
the kidnappers.
The kidnappers.
Yeah.
So much has to go into those conversations, right? And I'm assuming emotional intelligence is a part of that, so I would love to hear about that.
Yeah.
And I also would want to hear about all the things that kind of help you when you communicate and when you try to negotiate with people.
Yeah. So one of the things that is important to get the way we look at negotiations. I know we have the tendency to think of negotiations as a transaction, or to look at what is the final transaction that took place, the give and take, that art, and there's great books about that. Donald Trump wrote a book about that, The Art of the Deal. Chris Voss, everybody knows Chris Voss, Never Split the Difference. It's a great book. He's a FBI hostage negotiator, former, that wrote a book, and these are the how-to books. And they're written, and if you follow them to a T, and imitate them, you can absolutely be the best negotiator ever if you were them.
Okay.
But most of us are not them.
Correct.
And there's a reason why certain personality types write those books. They're open to those. That's what goes to them. And that's, I believe it does two disservices to us as a society, despite the fact that the books are fantastic. Number one, people who don't share the same personality types, they try to imitate them. And if you're not authentic, you crush and burn. Now some people can bluff, I cannot. My face, I cannot play poker. My face shows it in a second. Mm-hmm. If you're trying to assume somebody else's personality, it shows and you fail. So that's one way that it does this disservice. The second way it does this disservice is that people that know that they're not that type of personality, introverts, quiet, less, different personality types, they assume that they can't be good at this. And so they give up on the field. And the truth is, the best negotiation teams are diverse in personalities.
You need a little bit of everything.
You have to. Governor Richardson was much more of a type of, he could bluff. He was a bully when he needed to be. He was a strong kind of thing. I'm not. I can't act even if my life depends on it. So I lead with my own personality. I lead with vulnerability. I've learned about myself that when I speak, the fact that I'm genuine comes through. I don't need to say it. They say, hey, Dror, I'm a very genuine guy. Like, I don't need to say it. I act, I participate in it. The way I speak, I've learned that comes through. So I lean with vulnerability. So when I want to engage with somebody, my method, and it's not right for everybody, but it's right for me, my method is that I actually find something very personal about myself to share. And I'm comfortable in that space of sharing that vulnerability, because in a way you're almost telling the other side, if it's a North Korean officer or if it's an Iranian officer that you're negotiating, you're almost showing your vulnerability. You're exposing your neck. And that gives security to the other side, that they can actually open up as well, because if you try to go after them, you're exposed. And that's an invitation. And it's risky, because sometimes somebody will just bite at you. That happens every now and then, and you feel terrible about it, and then you get over it and you continue. But I found that more often than not, it actually invites people to open up themselves. And you create at that point a relationship, even if we're on opposite sides, nationally or in a specific negotiation team, we start sharing the intentions. We start believing each other's intentions, and that helps us build the trust and find ways to get where we need to get together.
That's incredible. First of all, because of the skill set that you've developed with the years and the acknowledgement of not only your contribution, but other types of personalities in the room, right? Because we're always used to having, the alpha personalities to lead the conversation.
That's the thing, and there's no such thing as good personality or bad personality. And there's no good or bad personality for negotiations or leadership or communications. But certain personalities become dominant. And the other personalities are passive. And so they do become the big talkers of the field, and we're missing a lot of talent and a lot of abilities. And look, we have, give you two separate administrations, U.S. administrations. We have the Trump administration, we have the Biden administration. And this is, again, I'm not judging, it's not about judgment, it's about comparing in terms of personalities almost of the administration. Donald Trump, much more of a bully, tough guy, works really well against bullies, against other bullies. So he was confronting the enemies of the United States in a way that they were talking the same language. And at times, and I'm not a Trump supporter, but at times it was actually effective. Objectively, you look at it and say, oh my God, he actually, maybe he didn't intend it that way, but it came out that way and it was good. In the Biden administration, everybody's much softer from that perspective. Again, very thoughtful, very smart, experts in their fields, but we don't have a bully when we need one. So that works really well with our allies, but doesn't work well with the bullies of the world. Donald Trump worked really well with the bullies of the world, but did not work well with our allies because of that personality change. And we used to have in the past, in previous administrations, whether it's Obama, whether it's Clinton, whether it's Bush Jr. and Bush Sr., these are the ones that I lived through.
Right.
There was a diversity in personalities. So under Clinton, and actually he was under Obama until he passed away, Dick Holbrooke, Democrat, was a special envoy to Afghanistan. So he was a bully. Democrat bully, but a bully, and there was a diversity in the team. Right now, you're thinking about it, do we have a single bully that serves in the administration to actually deal with the bullies? We don't have that. We don't have that matchup.
That's incredibly important. And it's important for your field, obviously. And also, I'm thinking of every team that needs to be built needs that diversity.
Yeah.
And we always have that tendency to be drawn to people that are similar to us, right?
Correct.
It's just more convenient for us. But everyone has a voice.
Yeah, and we need to acknowledge that, and that's in business, and that's in organizations and in the communities. We need to build that diversity. But we not only build that diversity, but have the maturity inside the team to recognize which personality might work in which situation, and just let it be.
Mm-hmm.
And that's a hard thing to do.
That's a very hard thing to do.
Yeah.
When you talk about you sharing personal stories a little bit to relate to people, it almost...
Look at that, by the way. We just started here, and I shared a very personal story about my wife.
Yeah.
And it's my method, to get in to say, hey, it's okay. I'm inviting you. Like, this is a personal conversation.
Right.
And
you're giving an invitation.
And it's not fake. It's authentic.
Yeah.
If it's fake, it won't work. Yeah.
Yeah. This is one of your greatness. But when you share one of those personal stories, and you probably have to pick and choose the right one at the right time with kidnappers, you make it almost sound as if they are humane, right?
Yes.
Which to us, like the other side, the good side, right? We kept looking at them and seeing monsters, right? We're seeing people that are doing the worst things that we can imagine. But it almost sounds like you have to relate to them to kind of understand their point of view, to make progress in negotiation. Yeah. Have you ever really related to their motives, to the reason why they're kidnapping, to the reason why they're doing things?
Yes. But again, I make the distinction, very clear distinction here, empathy and sympathy. I come very close because I deploy a lot of empathy. I come very close to understanding exactly why they do what they do. It's important for me to understand that. And then I have to keep myself in check. And sometimes, interestingly enough, again, it goes back to my wife. She helps me stay grounded on this and keep me in check, because there is a line that you can cross without noticing. And it actually happens to ambassadors a lot. When ambassadors go and they serve a certain country, in a certain country, and they live in that country and they deploy empathy towards its people, and at some point they might cross the line into sympathy. And again, that's when you align yourself with their objectives. Some of the extreme, I'll start with the less extreme, and then we can talk about the extreme cases. But one of the things, I go to audiences here in the United States and I say, hey, by the way, what should we do about North Korea? Everybody has at least 3 opinions, right, about policy. And they throw out things. And then you kind of push that, okay, I get it. Now, anybody can tell me why the North Koreans hate us so much? There's silence.
Silence.
Because we don't think about that. And it's not like I'm genius and I figured it out before. It happened to me when I was in Pyongyang. At the moment, it was actually not my first visit to Pyongyang. When it occurred to me, they took me to a museum, to the War Museum. We call it the Korean War Museum. They call it the American War Museum. And in passing there, the guide, she mentioned kind of like, oh yeah, we had 4.5 million Koreans died in that war. Yeah.
Yeah.
And I felt
the aha moment.
Immediately, I was like, you feel that punch to the stomach. Wait, what? Now, I didn't have an ability to Google to check it.
Sure.
I was in Pyongyang. But it is true. And it's not only North Koreans, it's Koreans, it's South Koreans and North Koreans, but they're the same people, same families. 4.5 million. And in my head, I'm starting to think, wait a minute, that was about a decade after the Holocaust. And I'm not comparing the two. The Holocaust was a systemic killing of Jews. The Korean War was war. But the sheer number, in the same time frame, more or less, since then, I know, how much the Holocaust impacts my life, my family's life, survivors, those who didn't survive, everything. It's new, it's fresh, it's grandparents. That must have had the same impact on the people I'm negotiating with over there. And more than that, I realized I had reconciliation with Germany. I have Holocaust Memorial Days, international and national. I have Holocaust museums in most capitals in the United States.
International recognition.
There's recognition. There's acknowledgement of what happened. Most Americans, even if they know that there was such a thing as the Korean War, we think of this little war between World War II and Vietnam. It doesn't occur to us. There hasn't been any acknowledgement of that. Not an apology. It's not about apologies. It's just acknowledgement. And when I understood that, and this was in North Korea, that's the time we were negotiating for the release of Otto Warmbier, the American student from Cincinnati, who was a University of Virginia student. I went, after that I had a meeting with the Vice Minister of Foreign Affairs, who was my negotiation partner. And the meetings in North Korea, the way they start, they have the official part of it. You sit
Give
there.
us a glimpse, yeah.
You sit there, and it's in Korean, which I don't speak, obviously. And the first part is, you're the source of all evil, you're trying to kill our leader, all of these kind of things that if I'm a diplomat, I have to protest, I have to stand up, I have to storm out of the room. I'm not.
But you're not.
I'm a fringe diplomat, which means that I can sit and take it and let it roll. But more than that, to me, that is where I hear the authentic narrative. Because they're not bluffing. What they're saying, even though it's inaccurate from my perspective, it is how they see it. So I take it in. This is my raw source. And in this case, he said all of that, and then you're supposed to respond to this. And then typically the meeting breaks, everybody raises a glass of cognac, and then you actually start talking in English, and you can actually do the negotiations. But when it was my part in that meeting, I told the Vice Minister Han, I said, hey, I'm going to go to my talking points in a second, but I have to tell you. And I told him about the visit to the museum the day before. And I said, look, I've been working with you guys for 6 years now. I never knew that. And now that I understand that I'm Jewish, I was raised on the lessons and the consequences of the Holocaust. I now have a much better understanding of the canyon that exists between us.
Wow.
And there's nothing I can do about it except to let you know that most Americans are not aware of this. And the whole nature of the meeting changed.
That's incredible.
And that's where it comes to play, because suddenly you understand, like, something that I didn't know. What is the emotional baggage that they come? And by the way, it's true here, and now we're going a little bit more on the Israeli and Jewish side of things. There's a lot of misunderstanding here when people don't understand why Israel reacts the way it reacts to any attack, to any casualties. And I don't remember who told me, I think it was Amei Alon that told me that, but it stuck with me. People don't understand, when Israelis count casualties, we don't count 1, 2, 3. We count 6 million 1, 6 million 2, 6 million 3. And again, this is not about justification or not justification, but it absolutely is about understanding the baggage that Israelis and the Jewish community comes into something. So if we're looking at what's happening now in the United States, I know I'm jumping way ahead here, but if we're looking at what's happening in the United States and that fear of suddenly the rise of anti-Semitism, and October 7th, the aftermath of October 7th, I think, like, it's all of that generational and peoplehood trauma that is coming in context. Now, I'm not comparing Israelis to North Koreans, very different, but there's something about the psychology of it and understanding the level of trauma that we're coming, the baggage we're coming into conversation, that suddenly explains why there is a reaction to things. And unless we deal with it and understand it on an emotional level, we're going to have a really hard time translating people understanding us, we understanding other people.
So what is the due diligence that you do and the research that you have to do walking into those conversations?
Well, there's two types of them. One of it is, so look, we're a non-government organization. We're non-profit. We work on behalf of families at their request at no money, at no cost to them. So we raise our money elsewhere. So there's two types of due diligence that we need to do. The first one, when a family comes to us with a case, we have to make sure that the case is actually a wrongful detention. That's the term that is used legally in the United States. We used to call it political prisoners, or hostages. Now we call it wrongful detention. There's a law about that. And there's three categories on that.
Yeah, explain to us what that term means.
The first one is somebody who's been targeted abroad because they're American. Somebody who's been taken, I'm talking specifically about Americans now, because they're carrying the passport, because the captors, the people who take them, want to extract a certain cost from the United States government. It has nothing to do with the individual. And that's
they were at the wrong place at the wrong time?
They were targeted. Sometimes they were not even at the wrong place. Sometimes we had cases in Venezuela that the Americans that were taken were actually taken from Colombia.
Wow.
It's a practice. It happens when there's an interest. But that's very specific, and that's a little bit more rare than you see, because there's a whole entity in government that is looking at this. Brittany Griner was one of those. She was targeted because of who she is, because of her profile, because she's American. The Russians wanted negotiations over this. Trevor Reed was like that. Paul Whelan was like that. That's in Russia. Then there's a second category. These are Americans that were not targeted because they're Americans. They were picked up because either allegedly they did something wrong, or they actually did something wrong in that country on their own. But once they were in the system, they were treated differently because they're Americans. So the sentencing or the trial and stuff like that is very different than if a national, a local national, will have the same infraction of the law. And that is, again, it's a wrongful detention. Well, we don't call it wrongful detention. We say maybe it's not a wrongful detention, but detention nevertheless is wrong.
Okay. The distinction is important.
Yeah, and so, for example, a case like that it would be Andrei Khachaturian. He's a guy from Los Angeles, a plumber, that went, this is before the war in Ukraine, he went from Los Angeles to Armenia, but the flights always went to Moscow. Again, this is before the war. And he had his personal gun. He followed the procedures with the airline. He put it in, checked luggage, had all the paperwork, did all of that. When he was in transit, for some reason, they called in his suitcase into the transit area. And at that point, suddenly he had access to the gun. He immediately got arrested. He didn't touch the gun, but the fact is he had access. They made him sign visas as if he enters Russia, because at that point he's in violation of Russian law.
Wow.
Okay, so he wasn't targeted because he's American. But once the infraction happened, he got an 8-year sentence for something that if a Russian would have had that, would be a fine, and you get out. Maybe 2 days detention, 8 years. So that's an example of that kind of order. So his detention is wrong and he needs to come home. He's an American. The third category is Americans who are not targeted because they're Americans. They did something or allegedly did something, and they're actually treated equally to any other national or local that would do the same thing. And yet when they get sentenced, the conditions of their imprisonment are just not acceptable. And that happened a lot during the pandemic, and it happens a lot in other countries. And there, it's not about a matter of justice, it's a matter of we do need to take care of our people, and we try to help them. So there's, and the reaction to each of those is very, very different, obviously. So these are kind of, that's the one type of due diligence that we need to do. And I have to tell you, it's extremely tough to do it, because for any parents or family members that come to us, trust me, their loved ones is always innocent. And we need to be very, very careful, because it's enough one time that we actually try to bring somebody home that actually did something really bad, we lose all of our credibilities. All of our moral authority gets lost. So we need to be very, very careful. And we don't always have access to information. So there are different ways that we try and find that information, do our own due diligence, figure out, and a lot of them are gray areas. And you need to make like everything else in life, it's a lot of gray area. And you need to figure out how to help.
Are there cases that you have to say no, thank you, I can't take care of this case?
There are more cases that we have to say no, thank you, than cases that we take.
Wow. That's a tough conversation to have.
That is a very tough conversation. Without naming names, obviously, I had cases. I had a case of somebody who killed somebody, and when we did our due diligence, they found human remains in his freezer. It's like, I get people out of prison, I don't get criminals out of prison. And that's a tough conversation, because of course, for the parents always, he's been framed. But when you actually look, and I'm not a lawyer, but when you get advice of lawyers that were there, that saw the trial stuff, and it's like, yeah, no, that's pretty straightforward kind of thing. I had a case of pedophilia that we just can't touch it, but go and explain to the wife that, sorry, your husband is not a political prisoner.
And she had to hear about this from you for the first time?
Yes. Yes.
So that's a very hard process
to go through. It's a very hard conversation. And sometimes there are cases that are absolutely wrongful, but yet we don't take them because we are, in our assessment, we actually can't help. And that's very frustrating when it happens, but we don't want to mislead families, to give them false hope that we can help. I'll give you an example. We have never been successful in getting anybody out of China. And there's a lot of Americans held in China. Part of it is because the Chinese just don't do informal. And we've learned it. And so when we do work and we do communicate with families of Americans who are held in China, but we're very honest with them. I said, look, I wish we could, but we can't even enter through the door, so we can't have what we need to do. But we'll help you on the American side of it, of navigating within the government and advocacy around it. So all of that is about one part of the due diligence that we need to do about the cases. Then there's the due diligence when you actually are about to meet with a captor or a leader of a country, or not even the leader, but anybody underneath that leader and down to a staffer.
How do you even prepare for those meetings?
So these are...
Except for trying to control your heart rate.
Yeah, well, that you can't control, so you give up. No, but I spend a lot of time, I rely on raw material or primary sources. So if it's a leader, if there's somebody who has enough evidence there, they gave speeches, they did interviews, I try to listen to their words, to their tone, try to learn who they are through that, try to pick something about their personality.
That's the emotional intelligence aspect again.
Yeah.
Trying to figure out those
And I'll give you an example of that. When I went to the same trip in North Korea, when you land there, before you even have the big meetings, there's always two guys that we refer to them as minders, but they're the two guys that are constantly with you. And they're typically younger foreign service officers, North Koreans. And by the way, there's always two of them to make sure that one minds the other. Because if it's only one-on-one, you might turn somebody. So there's that level of it. And even though you never know in advance who's the guy that is going to be attached to you, because typically it's always a new person, very quickly on the moment you might not know them, but you know their position. You know that it's one of their early assignments, because I'm not a head of state or diplomat, so it's, you can give the young guy to do that. Second, I know that their responsibility in those first few days with me in North Korea, before I even have the first meeting, is to extract from me the full authority that I'm there to negotiate. What am I there to propose, what I'm authorized to do, because they need to write that memo, send it to their boss, who needs to send it to the boss, so they get a response, so they know how they can answer me in the actual meeting. Now, if my guy's memo is not accurate, the consequences are severe. And I know that.
Have you ever been fearful?
For that, so once I know and I understand that, so I know nothing about the guy individually, except for the fact that I know that this is high stakes for him, high pressure. I also know that if his memo is not accurate, it's not only he will pay a price for it, but there's no way I can succeed. Because if I'm surprising them in the meeting, they don't have the authority to respond to me. So I won't succeed. So at that point, I looked at him, and this guy, the guy name was Kim. That was in 2016 when I was there for automobile negotiation. And he's a really nice guy. And we started a little bit trying to chit-chat in the car, and I realized that, by the way, it's my go-to. You find out somebody's a father, he has a daughter, pulled up my phone, showed pictures of my daughter, comparing, talking about the special relationship. Again, human beings.
It's a neutral ground, right?
Yeah.
Speaking about children, the innocence.
And the relationship between a daughter and a father, and we're joking how we don't deserve it, but fathers always have an easier time with daughters.
Absolutely.
In which we don't know why. And we're again, as two human beings talking about it. And then I looked at him and I said, and again, I'm leading with my thing, which was genuine. I'm really nervous. And he looks at me and said, why? I said, look, this is my first time leading the mission. I don't have Governor Richardson over here with me. And if I screw this up, he's going to kill me. Now, I use those terms, obviously, it's true. If I would screw it up, he will be really mad at me. He wouldn't kill me, but I know that I needed to make the stakes higher. This one, he looked at me because I knew that that's what he feels.
Yeah.
And that's the stakes of him. And from that point on, I told him, like, after he looked at me like that, and I said, look, so ask me any questions you need. I will give you the information, and I will not surprise you in the meeting. Because I know that if you fail, there's no way for me to succeed.
Right.
And even though we're two on the separate parts of the negotiations, at that point we started, he felt more comfortable asking me the questions of how much how many exchanges of money for remains of Americans, stuff like that. There was a lot of substance there, what to do. To the extent that when I ended up going into that official meeting, he looked at me as I go, he was not allowed in the meeting, and he looked at me and said, good luck with this, but it was a genuine good luck. We wanted it to succeed.
Yeah.
And in that specific meeting, we actually didn't get the results that we wanted. And he came out and he was sure that it's going to be positive. And you could see it on his face. And I walked out and he looked at me and I said, no. And he was genuinely sad that we couldn't get a deal over Otto Warmbier in that visit. And then he looked at me and he said, Mickey, there's a saying in my country. It takes 100 hacks to take down a tree. And I looked at him, and my reaction to him was like, well, I hope I don't need to come back 99 more times in order to get Otto home. But I got what he was saying, like, don't give up. Don't give up. We're in it. That's the power of this, that connection, that human connection. And I still, to this day, I don't have a contact with him because I can't do that, but I can tell you that it will come back at some point. Because I remember Governor Richardson used to tell me the story when he was in his first visit to North Korea in 1994. He was a young congressman. He went there, and the day he came, the North Koreans shot down a Red Cross helicopter with 2 American pilots. And President Clinton told him, you're staying there until you convince them to bring them back. And that's what he did. That was Richardson's first ever experience in something like that. The young officer that was with him was a young North Korean officer named Park. Park is now the ambassador, the North Korean ambassador to the UN. He's a great guy.
Wow.
Personally, on a personal level, again, forget about North Korea. We have a personal connection. We've been working together, and it comes back, and you build on these relationships.
Of course, and I'm sure you have so many at this point.
You develop a lot, quite a few.
That's incredible.
Yeah, and sometimes people disappear, and you think, oh, we'll never see them again, and then they come back somehow. The governor used to joke that that's why he likes. There's 2 reasons why he likes working with autocracies or dictatorships. One, he says the leaders just really rarely change. And the people, they're always in the orbit, so they come back. You have years of investing in a relationship, and it builds up. And the second one, he says, once you convince the leader of something, that's it. You go in democracy, now you need to get it in the parliament, you need it with the cabinet.
You need it over and over and over again.
Yeah.
Fair point.
Yeah.
Before we talk about Israel for a little bit, I'm very curious as to what are the tools, what are the things that you have to put on the table to bargain when you're in the middle of a negotiation? What are the things that you can offer?
So that's a great question, because we're not a government. We don't have an authority. We never go on behalf of a government. So
is it a good thing or a bad thing?
Both. Both. It's a bad thing because, hey, I wish I had the authority to release when I figured out an exchange is valuable and say, yeah, let's do it and let's get it done. Sometimes we're able to release somebody on our own. Danny Fenster from Myanmar, we brought back on our own. Taylor Dudley, we brought back on our own from Russia. And those are typically made because of emotional attachments and emotional leverage. So we create enough of a relationship for the captors to say, yeah, no, we're going to do that for you. So it still is a sort of a transaction, but it is really the way I like to look at negotiations, which is our ability to influence somebody else's behavior. But most of the times, we go and we negotiate and we come up with the terms, the pathway, the theory of return, the shortest way of somebody coming home, but we can't deliver what is needed for that. We then need to go and convince our own government to do it. And many times that is harder than actually getting the deal from the captors. It was true with Russia when we did Trevor Reed for Konstantin Yaroshenko. The US government didn't want to do this. Not because they didn't want Trevor home. Absolutely, they wanted Trevor home. They worked really, really hard, like they do work really hard on all of the other prisoners. but there was a genuine question that they needed to solve internally, whether those kind of exchanges are something that they are willing to do or not. And for me and the family, we don't have that time.
Right.
Any day that passes, something bad can happen in prison. You can get sick and die, somebody can kill you, or you might take your own life. It's really, really tough.
There's only one goal.
Yeah, and so when we go, unlike the government, we're like horses with blinders. There's only one thing for us to deal with. But if you're the American, I'm a Russian official, and you say, let's go and meet and let's talk about Paul Whelan or Evan Gershowitz. Before we say the first word in our meeting, there's supposed to be only about those two. The weight of the war in Ukraine, the weight of nuclear stability, the weight of world order and everything else in conflicts between us, making it almost impossible for official diplomats to keep this issue insulated. That's something that we can do and that we do. And then we bring those offers and we need to convince our own government. And so the same negotiations, sometimes they're tougher, are actually to convince our own government to do it. And sometimes they don't want to, sometimes they do. Sometimes we do things that make them really not like us, to force it. But
Your own government.
Our own government. Yeah. And if we take that, and I know we want to go there, and so here I go there. When we're looking on October 7th, and we're looking at the different deals that were on the table over time, it's hard and challenging to get to that deal. It's even more challenging to get the Israeli Prime Minister to agree to those.
Wow.
And that has been a frustrating part of this work.
Okay, so I want to hear more about that, and I want to relate to another sentence that you wrote in the book, and that relates to the 2006 Second Lebanon War and the way that it broke and the way that it started. And you're describing the situation to your friend.
Yeah.
And you're saying, Israelis will stop at nothing. We will do anything to get our people back, including go to war. Israel will declare war tonight, I have no doubt.
Yeah.
Right? And so we know how that story ended, right? And we know that we went to war.
Yeah.
I wanna relate to October 7th and Israel. You're an Israeli.
Yeah.
You're a Jewish man.
Yeah.
Where does October 7th find you?
Finds me at home in Arlington, Virginia, Saturday, waking up, big mess. The first thing that happens to me is probably the closest, my wife knows that, the closest I've ever been to a PTSD. Because by the time I get my bearing and understand what is happening, that is the time when you start seeing and hearing the special units that were called for reinforcement. These are units that I served with. Shaldag, Matkal, Seret Tzanchanim, the paratroopers unit, which was my unit for quite a while. And even though I never served in Gaza, the smells, the fields, all of that, I know exactly what's happening. I don't know, it's not the same people, I'm old. But it's the same, like, you know that, and you watch it, and you watch them riding in there, and it's just the thing that pains me is to know, like, so much loss of life is about to happen. And I have a really, really hard time coping with loss of life that I think can be prevented. It happened to me in the Second Lebanon War too, because that was my parent. I saw them how they go in. I said, no, people, like, we were there. They were riding into Binge-Bill, and I was like, don't you remember? We built tunnels underneath there. What do you think, that Hezbollah didn't use those tunnels for all these years? And then they blow up, and it's just that it tears you apart. But there was so many things that collapsed for us. In terms of the comforts that we had about the competency of the intelligence and of the special units and the power. And again, it's not, I'm sure Israel will go through an investigation of what took place, but emotionally for us, not only for Israelis, not only for the Jewish community in the United States, but for the entire community in the United States, a lot of things collapsed in concepts that day. And And we never really we haven't gotten an opportunity to even deal with it. But that was kind of the first few hours. And you just attach yourself. I have my family there. My mother still lives in Ra'anana, 76 years old. My brother, his wife, and 3 kids live in Kibbutz Nir in the north. I had no doubt that this is going to light up. They've been displaced since. And then I got a phone call from Leah Goldin. Mm-hmm. Leah Goldin, the mother of Hadar Goldin, who was killed 10 years before in a ceasefire, during a ceasefire, an hour into the ceasefire, and his body is still held. Right. And I've been working with Leah, trying to get Hadar remains back unsuccessfully. And she calls me, and she says, Mickey, do you know how for 10 years nobody has been listening to me? Well, I'm getting a lot of phone calls from families of people who they believe are missing. They don't know if they're in Gaza or not, but they're missing. They know that I've been in this for a long time. Can I send them your way? And I said, absolutely. That was the time when the government of Israel and the military was still focused, 48 hours of clearing up existing Hamas.
Still managing the
Yeah, Hamas was still inside Israel. Nobody was talking to families. The government didn't understand that the families are a source of intelligence. They knew who was missing. They saw them as like, we don't have anything to tell them, so let's not talk to them. So Leah Goldin started a call center. And she started collecting names and built up a database very quickly of the people. It wasn't comprehensive, it wasn't complete, but it was something physical. But we had to step in and say, okay, now we have to come up with our theory of return. How do we solve this? There's the sprint and then there's a marathon, but the sprint. And we had some basic assumptions that for most people they're not rocket science, but putting them together makes sense. Number one, Israel and Hamas don't directly talk. And even the kind of proximity talks that I used to do when we did Gilad Shalit negotiations in 2007, 2008, where we were in one hotel and we had members of each side in different floors and doing all that, even that is not even a possibility now. That's number one. Number two, there are countries and entities in these countries that can influence Hamas. Nobody can control them. They're a very proud, independent Palestinian program. Mm-hmm. But there's some countries and entities that can influence them. Iran, Turkey, Egypt, and Qatar. None of them have any interest to do favors to Israel. But at least... Not even Egypt. But at least 2 of them do have an interest in working with the United States. And that's Egypt and Qatar. So from there, the theory of return was very clear to us. We needed to make sure first that this is an American priority, that this becomes an American story at the presidential level very quickly.
And it wasn't automatically considered an American interest?
I'm talking about the first 24 hours. Mm-hmm. Nobody knew what the hell was happening.
Right.
So I asked Leah, I called Leah Goldin, I said, hey, within your call center, I need you to ask these following questions to solicit any information, any name of American citizens, American permanent residents, and people who studied in American universities. I'm looking for any linkages. I need to build that up.
And there's a few of them.
But that's number one element of the theory of return. Once we have that, once it's an American priority, then for me, the Qataris, who I work very closely with, they helped us get people out of Iran, they helped us get people out of Afghanistan, they helped us get people out of Venezuela. They've been partners of ours in a lot of this work. When they know it's an American priority, they can go and lean on Hamas and say, hey guys, forget about Israel here for a second, we have a problem. Don't make us choose here. You need to help us get a proposal of how we solve the hostage situation here. Solicit that proposal, and if that proposal is even somehow feasible, and those are never nice proposals, they're never just, they never feel right, but if it's feasible, then the American government can help the Israeli government become as comfortable as possible in order to accept and implement it. That's the theory of return of this. Pretty simple, right? My first call was to my colleagues in Qatar to validate whether I'm right about this. And they said, look, we need this, we need evidence that this is the president's authority. Now, I didn't need to convince the American government on this. I believe that what we saw with President Biden in those first hours and the first days, that's his DNA. He showed up. It's not politics. It's not calculated. It's an instinct.
And you talk from experience.
Yeah. And he went and he had the Zoom with the hostage families, and then within 5 days he met them. Now I have families of American hostages in other countries, 7, 11, 16 years that haven't yet received a phone call from the White House.
Wow.
This is, I told that to the Israeli families. This is significant. But that was exactly what the mediators needed. And they went in, and the first thing was to do a proof of concept. So they went in and said, look, we need to prove to the Americans that we can deliver on this. And 2 American women were released. That was not a negotiated agreement.
So that was not a coincidence?
No, it was not a coincidence. That was a proof of concept to show the Americans this channel can work. Mm-hmm. Let's work it. And then the Americans gave, following that, the Americans gave the instructions to the Qataris saying, okay, we don't want you to solicit a deal for the Americans. We want you to solicit the deals for everybody. And they started doing that. And I'm never part of the official negotiations. I don't work for governments, and they don't ask me to do that. But I'm in the parameters. I always have the phone calls because I have the personal relationships and understanding who's who, where's where. At that point, I was asked already by about 67 families, hostage families, to help them. And so I was, it didn't really matter the individual because it was a collective response to it. But I was handling a lot of these families. And as the proposal came in, and it was feasible to do this, I flew to Israel. And I spent a lot of time with victims, with survivors, with their families. I heard stories that were so horrific in the details of them, survivors, especially from the music festival, that I had to take them in and bury them inside deep. In myself, because otherwise I wouldn't be able to be productive.
You would just sink in.
Yeah. And so I buried them in, and I kept, again, focused, and we were working together with the forum at the time, the family forum in Israel, and all these families and different advisors. It wasn't only me, there's a whole bunch of people, I don't even know all of them, working on trying to get the Israeli government to say yes to that deal. And once we were able to do that, that was a Thursday, when the Israeli government approved that deal, I had to hop from Tel Aviv to Doha. Now, I went through Yerevan because I had some negotiations with the Russians to do. I know, it's a weird world. But I ended up in Doha, and I basically plucked myself in Doha for the duration of the implementation of that deal.
Wow.
Because every single day was negotiations like from the beginning. Because Hamas almost always showed up lower than the expectations of the Israelis. And the Israelis showed up with lower than the expectations of Hamas. And there's a reason for that. It's not because they're trying to cheat. It's because in order to get to a deal like that, the mediators use constructive ambiguity. It's when there's real gaps between the sides, but they're using enough ambiguous language to get together, hoping that you can fix the problem in the last minute, because both sides will be eager enough to get a deal.
Wow. And every day of the deal was like that?
Every day of the deal was like that. That's why you would see it in the drama unfolding. The timing was wrong, the categories were wrong, the categories of hostages, the categories of prisoners that were released in return, all of this ongoing. Now, that's happening around the table in the formal table between the sides, the Israelis and the Qataris, and then Hamas and the Qataris, all of that stuff. But there are things that they cannot share or test on the official table. So I get the phone call from either side, say, hey, do you think that the other side will walk away if we miss this, or if we do that? And I would call the other side. And so they're testing through me, and I'm not the only one, but they're testing all of this. And we were able to keep it together until we didn't. But 109 hostages came home through this. And relatively in short time. And if this is 54 days. I know it's a nightmare for the hostages, but
and it sounded
overall,
like such a long time.
Yeah.
In the first 54 days, right?
Correct.
Because we never thought
and now we're
be
looking back at almost 250 days, I think now, almost getting there. But when we failed the last day, I went on a plane because there was nothing for me to do at that point. I flew back to DC to be with my family.
As if you can emotionally just shift like that?
I couldn't, because I mean, I knew that it was about 10, 14 days at least of fighting before we can go back and see where it's at. That was 15 hours of a flight when you're locked in a plane. Everything that I buried inside bubbled up.
Wow.
All these stories came out. And I was in one of the most significant existential crises for me.
Wow.
Because for somebody like me, and what I do and what I talk and communicate and engage with people, you know, everybody, in order to get something tangible, knowing what some of these people did in the music festival, I couldn't reconcile, who am I talking to here? It just seemed like we crossed a line that I just couldn't comprehend. I was grasping at anything I could hold to find the humanity, just so I can. And
so you could relate to them in some way.
So even things like knowing that the IDF found drugs that were used by the terrorists on this one, which is something we know from Africa. They used to do with child soldiers. Is you give them drugs to lower the inhibition, so they're actually, were they not human when they did it? Is that something that I can hold to? That there's still humanity in them because they were under chemicals when they did it. Really like reaching, just in order to have something. And there are two things that held me together. Two faces. One was Aviva Siegel, who was one of the hostages that was released, that I worked with her family very closely. Her husband, Keith, is still held. And I was with that family just 3 days before she was released. And I told them that I believe she's coming home. So that was like, it just gave me that, because I know them and I know that she's home. The second one was Abigail. And it just, I cling to that. That's
really?
Worth it. That's why we do this. But it was a real existential crisis for me on this. And we did, I tell you a long story here, but we came back and it did. It was like, I thought it would be 14 days, it was 10 days. And then individual members from the Israeli negotiation team asked me to go back to Doha, because they were not authorized to do it themselves. But they wanted to start soliciting understanding of what is possible now for the next round, so they can convince the prime minister to go, to send them back into negotiations. And here's the thing, and I know it's going to be very different and everybody has different variations of it, but as of late December, around December 20th and onwards, a similar deal to the deal that we're talking about now was available.
December 20th?
Yeah.
That's almost 6 months ago.
Almost 7, I think, right? Yeah. 6, you're right. 6 months ago. The only thing is that back then we had more hostages alive.
Correct.
And there's two things that I've learned 18 years of doing it, two cardinal truths. The first one, the deals never get better over time. We tell ourselves stories that they are, but they never get better over time.
And you probably tried to convey that message.
And number two, time always hurts the hostages.
Wow.
And so when I try to convince the Israelis that it's not going to get better than this, let's do it. And to me, the logic is like, oh, it's a terrible deal. It's like, I know it's a terrible deal, but there's nothing in it that is existentially threatening the state of Israel. Mm-hmm. And therefore, we can do it. We're strong enough to do it. Get our people home, and then you're unburdened by that. But I think you can make decisions of what is right for Israel, whatever those are, later, but without the burden of the hostages. And I can tell you that in January and in February and definitely in March, just before Ramadan, I would have the same members of the Israeli team, and these are individuals. I never work, it's never the official ask, yeah. But they're members of individual members, and they told me, oh, can we go back to the deal from December? Like, no.
It doesn't exist.
But the deal now is terrible. It's like, I know, but take this one because the deal next month is going to be worse. And it's not that it's not that Hamas is changing the prices or anything like that. It's just that we have less hostages. So the numbers go down. But the demands in return are the same. They will want this, ultimately, they will want the same amount of prisoners released. They will want the same amount of withdrawal released. So it just feels like you're giving more for less.
It always feels like Hamas has the upper hand in this, right? Like to Israeli society, at least.
Yeah, and the truth is, and that's a really hard thing to digest, Israel took a beating on October 7th.
Mm-hmm.
Hamas is extracting the price, the cost of that now. And we can decide whether we want to pay that cost and get our people home or not.
Speaking of which.
And it's to me, it's a very clear, should be a very clear decision. But I've failed since then. 6 months, I've failed to bring that together. And I'm sitting with families, and sometimes you're running out of ideas.
Wow.
And it's really, really hard. We're coming up with all the different ideas of how to convince, how to create leverage. And we have hope. And so many times we felt like we're close, but we're not there.
And if you're saying that we're running out of ideas, I get concerned.
We don't give up. and truth is that there's, even when you run out of ideas, and it sometimes, like the new day comes and something pops and something happens, like, ooh, we can take advantage of that. We can take an opportunity in that. Yeah.
Wow. We're sitting here. It's a little over 2 days that we have 4 hostages released by a military operation, Operation Arnon, that unfortunately had lost. We lost the commander of the force trying to get in. And there's this kind of a great sensation in Israeli society of here's finally something to hold on to, right? Yeah. Here's a success story that we can show ourselves that we're still successful, that we still can get our own people back.
Yeah.
And there are these voices that say, why are we clinging to negotiations when we can try to have a military operation to release hostages? Yeah. What would you say to that?
First of all, the breaking news on this release and this operation caught me when I was flying from New York to LA.
On a plane again?
On a plane, and I was just getting that. And I have to say, I'm obviously all 4 equally happy that they're home. Noah Al-Gamani for me was a personal thing. My daughter's name is Noah. They actually look alike.
Wow.
And from October 7th, that video of her being taken, I was obsessed with trying to, whatever I could to get her home. So very emotional about the fact learning that she's on her way home. And like everything else in my world, and I think in the world in general, there's no wins without losses. Mm-hmm. And there's no losses without little wins that you can get into them. And it's extremely complex. There were costs to that operation. The ones that we know. Arnon, the commander, died. There are Palestinians who died, and I'm not even going to go there into that conversation because that's not what I'm focused on, but that happened, part of it. There was a choice, because there could have been a deal too. There was a choice to do it that way and not in a deal, and I'm grappling with that. Mm-hmm. That's hard. There's a power in renewing the national sense of like we can do it again after the failures that we had before. But there are unintended consequences that haunt me. Now that we reminded Hamas that we're still doing these operations, because we had one of them in the past as well, successful one. We had a bunch of failed that we're not talking about, but hostages died in failed attempts. Now that we reminded the people who guard those hostages that we're going after, tomorrow night, the night after that, a bookshelf falls, a dog barks.
What's their first response?
Kill the hostage. Because it's better for them to have a dead hostage than a rescued living hostage.
Right.
Now, we're not going to know how that played out, but that haunts me. So there are consequences to that. And at the end of the day, well, 7 hostages were rescued in military operation.
And how many died?
I know of at least 2 dozen that have died. And 109 returned in a negotiated agreement. Mm-hmm. Now, the negotiated agreement stings. It stings. I know it does. We don't want to pay the price. but I really think we're strong enough to do this. And there's nothing existentially threatening us by doing this. And we do it, and then we can make our own decisions of what happens next. It's not like you're signing a deal with a respectful partner here. And Israel used to be really, really good at inflicting the cost after we get our people back home, in making sure that everybody's been responsible for wronging an Israeli was either put to justice or taken out. We didn't do it after the Gilad Shalit deal. And I know the Gilad Shalit deal is very controversial now in Israel because Yahi Sinwar was released in that, as well as 1,100 prisoners. And I was a part of these mediations. I didn't conclude that deal, but it was that, and it was the right deal to do. It stung then, and it wasn't just, but it was the only way to get Gilad back home, and we needed to do it. At the time, we had one hostage, not 240, now 120. But what we didn't do after is what the problem was with that deal. We didn't go after the people who harmed Israelis, the people who are responsible for that, rearrest them. And we know now in Israel there's a lot of investigations into it. There were opportunities to do it and decisions not to. So I argue back, and it's a hard argument of everybody saying, oh, Gilad Shalit deal is what led to this. Like, no. Gilad Shalit deal was the Gilad Shalit deal because it had to be. What led to it is what we didn't do after the Gilad Shalit deal.
Wow. Before we finish,
yes,
you got me very concerned because you are verbalizing, I think, what everyone is thinking about the danger that the hostages are currently in.
Yeah.
Give us a reason for hope. Give us a reason to be a little optimistic about the future.
Yeah. So first of all, I'll say that, and I say genuinely. I do believe that Israel, as a society, as a country, as peoplehood, we're going to emerge out of this crisis altogether. We're going to leapfrog as a society. I think that, of course, the war, we need to, because the struggle in Israel is actually, the war is just delaying or holding back from the progress that needs to happen internally. I think that society in Israel is going to have a new social contract between the people in the country, and it's going to be way stronger and more defined. And it will help us figure out what is the state of Israel, what does it stand for, and refine that. And I believe that there's it's not about right and left in Israel, but it's about what is our national identity and what's to do. So I do think we come out of that much, much stronger. I don't think we hit rock bottom yet, unfortunately. So while I'm an optimist in the longer term, I'm a pessimist of where it's happening. And the fact that we're engaged right now in a war in Gaza, a war that is pending in the north, that Israel needs to figure out how it's going to solve it. And I'm telling you, with a brother that has been displaced, a security buffer that I used to serve it in Lebanon and now it's inside Israel. Correct. That needs to be flipped somehow. There are political solutions to it, but they're very hard to reach. It probably will be more violence, but Israel can't engage with that while 400,000 reservists are in the south. Something needs to move. So, and all of that is distracting us from the process of what I said that we need to get to. In other words, when you want to dig out of, or climb out of a hole, the first thing you need to do is stop digging. And we're still digging.
We're still digging.
Right now. So I'm an optimist in the long term for the state of Israel, for the new contract, social contract between the people and the government. And I think we'll get there, and I think it will be way better than what we had.
Okay.
At the same time, I say here in the United States, for the Jewish community, we're just at the beginning of a marathon. Because what we're seeing here is not going to disappear even when the war is over. There's been a lot of misinformation, a lot of true information that is being used in certain ways to incept pretty dark ideas in a big chunk of a population here. It doesn't go away. Maybe it doesn't become a priority anymore, so people are not in the streets or in the campuses, but every time there's a trigger, it will come back to it. And it's really important for us as a community to realize we're in a marathon now. It's not a quick fix for this. We're not even in the fixing process, but even when we get to the fixing process,
Do
it's
we
going to
still
be
even realize what the problem is?
and we need to invest because the way we invested in the past as a community, we can't do it in insulation. We need to find the allies that are in here, and counterintuitively, I think those allies are other minority groups that have been suffering from similar feelings or behaviors. Now they seem to be at odds with us. We need to fight back into their hearts because we were with them for a long time. And then October 7th failed. And I belong to that movement, to the progressive movement. I'm a member of that on values. And I feel like I've been orphaned.
Really?
Because my substance just doesn't matter suddenly. What matters is my resume.
Right.
I'm Jewish. I'm Israeli. Even worse, I'm a former officer.
You're a former officer.
So nothing that I say on the substance is not listened to. So I feel orphaned, and it's really disappointing because I believe in the values. We need to fight back for that. And you don't fix it quickly. We're going to have to spend a lot of time, a lot of our resources to very slowly creep back in there and set things and build those relationships. It's not about hasbara.
It's not.
It's not.
It's about relationship building.
Yeah.
And emotional intelligence could be helpful as well.
You know what they say? When you're a hammer, every problem is a nail. So since I do emotional intelligence, it seems every single problem is that problem and that's the solution. But I do believe in it.
Amen.
I do believe it is.
Mickey, you're incredible.
Oh.
Your work is phenomenal. And we could probably talk about for hours longer, and I have questions.
We probably did, right? Yeah. I don't even know.
I know, but I need to let you go because this is the time that you devoted for me. I'm grateful for our time. Your work is incredible. I just wish you success because your success is not just Israel's success, but it's humanity's success. Thank you for everything that you're doing, and it's been an honor, really.
Thank you very much.